Meet the Menendez family. They are extremely wealthy and live a life of privilege. They live in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the world. Jose, the dad, is not only of Cuban descent but comes from a very prestigious bloodline. He's also a very powerful Hollywood executive. At one point in time, he was the head of Hertz and responsible for this famous commercial with OJ. This is also him pictured with the group Menudo when he was the head of RCA Records. Everything about this family in the 80s and 90s spoke to and looked like money, power, and respect. But the Menendez family had a problem. Jose was an asshole, a highly abusive asshole, in particular to his two sons, Erik and Lyle. But he also had a lot of business enemies too. Now keep in mind, Jose was a Hollywood exec in the 80s and 90s, before Me Too, before Harvey Weinstein, and before Diddy. Long before them. Keep that in mind, times were very different in the 80s and 90s. Lyle and Erik had a lot of respect for their dad, but they were also conflicted because they were also sick of his abuse. Remember, next level abuse. So not just abusive, but also using their power to control other people. So one day, Erik and Lyle, who were 19 and 22 at the time, went and bought two shotguns, stormed into the den, and just started blasting both of their parents. The crime scene investigator said it was one of the most horrific scenes that they had ever seen in their life. There was skull and brain particles on the ceiling. Erik and Lyle shot both of their parents in both the knees to make it look like a mafia hit. Then they left, went to the movies. In case you were curious, they went to go see Batman. Came back, walked in, and acted like they had just discovered their parents' dead bodies. Here's what it sounded like when they called 911.
Beverly Hills emergency.
Yes, please.
What's the problem? What's the problem? What's the problem?
Someone killed my parents.
Pardon me?
Someone killed my parents.
What? Who? Are they still there?
Yes.
The people...
No.
Were they shot?
Hey, man,
Were they shot?
yes.
They were shot?
Yes.
102, 722 North Elmore.
What happened? Hey, stand up, hey.
I have a hysterical person on. We're trying to get things further. Other units is funny.
Now, before I continue with this next part, don't forget, extremely wealthy, privileged, Beverly Hills. Police walk in, they investigate the crime scene, and don't even consider these two suspects. Had they done even a little bit of due diligence, they would have found shotgun residue on their arms. Investigators notated that the shotgun shells were missing from the crime scene. It's because they were in Erik's car. Had they even looked, they would have found them. But the thought that anything could happen to a family like this in a neighborhood like this was not only beyond comprehension, but remember, asshole. Lots of business enemies. And don't forget that Erik and Lyle shot them in the knees. So when police saw that they had been shot in the knees, they immediately thought that this was a mafia hit, and that the brothers just happened to dodge a bullet, no pun intended, because they happened to be at the movies at the time. So Erik and Lyle are free. And at first, it seemed like they got away with murder. Lyle gave an eloquent eulogy at his parents' funeral. They were getting support from friends, family, and business associates. But then they started to live their life. They started buying Rolexes, Porsches, cars, lavish trips. Erik bought a $50,000 tennis trainer to help him go pro. Lyle bought bodyguards because he started running the family business. And according to him, he needed the bodyguards to protect himself because his dad made so many enemies. People also noticed that they still stayed in the same house. So on the surface, it not only looked like they were happy, but they were also celebrating. Behind the scenes, though, these two were struggling. But sometimes perception is reality. And that was the case with this woman, Pam Bozanich. She was a prosecutor, and when she heard about how the boys were living, she said, I know they did it, and she made it her personal business to make sure that she took them down. So she goes to investigators, and she says, this behavior is fishy. Find me something major. Meanwhile, there's an ongoing investigation of the murder of these two. Remember, this is a really big deal. People in Beverly Hills don't get murdered, and they don't get murdered like that. So this story was national attention. One day, investigators called Pam. They drove from LA to San Diego. And even though they didn't find the guns, they found the place that the boys purchased the guns. Pam said to them, "That's major enough, go get them." Now remember, this story is already national attention. And the spending spree these two are on went for months. So when Pam sent the orders to go get them, they wanted to make sure that there was a statement. They pulled Lyle over with the SWAT team. They made sure that the media was there. Erik was on a trip overseas but returned home and surrendered. Their family did not believe it. But here's where things start to get interesting. Erik and Lyle didn't have the heart to tell their family the truth. Not about what they did to their parents, but about what Jose did to them. Just remember that. It's going to come up later. So now Erik and Lyle are arrested. 3 years later, their trial starts. And this man, Judge Weisenberg, was assigned to their trial. Fresh off the Rodney King trial. If you don't know the Rodney King story, someone will explain it to you in the comment section. And as if this whole thing wasn't a shit show already, it was also the first trial to be shown on then brand new channel on cable TV, Court TV. So not only was there a lot of pressure, there was also a lot of eyeballs and a lot of attention. Now remember, Jose was highly abusive. So the defense was positioning themselves for a self-defense case. Prosecution was positioning this as money was the motive because of the 7-month spending spree they went on. So this trial is already setting up to be a shit show. Then enters this guy, Dr. Oziel. He was Erik's psychologist. So like I said, he was Erik's psychologist. But Lyle hated Dr. Oziel, which I'm going to get to in a second. Erik, when he was younger, got into some trouble. And this was when he was around the age of 12. And when that happened, it pissed off his dad, Jose. So keep this in mind, it's important. Dr. Oziel was hired by Jose several years earlier, back when Erik was 12. Dr. Oziel made a deal with Jose that anything Erik shares, Dr. Oziel would tell Jose. So he essentially agreed to break confidentiality to please Jose. Remember what I said, he was not only an asshole, but he would use his power against people. So now fast forward, when these two were on their spending spree, Erik was struggling emotionally. He was having thoughts of taking his own life. Goes to Dr. Oziel for help. When Lyle finds out, he's pissed because he understands that Dr. Oziel is not really there for Erik's benefit, but A, a Jose plant, but B, is someone who's not to be trusted and is out for their own benefit. So Dr. Oziel testifies that Erik came to see him. He asked Dr. Oziel to go for a walk. And according to Dr. Oziel, when he did, he leaned up against the light pole, like in an arrogant type of way, and said, "We did it," meaning that they killed their parents. To A, get away from their controlling dad, and B, according to Dr. Oziel, to put their mother out of her misery. According to Dr. Oziel, he's now in fear for his own safety. So he tells Erik to have Lyle come in. But here's where things get interesting. Dr. Oziel recorded his conversations with Lyle and Erik, which is a big-time confidentiality violation. Dr. Oziel actually ended up losing his license over this. So this is a big-time issue in the trial on whether or not the tapes should or should not be admissible. Because A, Lyle and Erik weren't aware that they were being recorded, but also B, they have a right to speak to their psychologist in confidence. So in comes this woman, Judelon Smith. This is Dr. Oziel's girlfriend. I forgot to mention to you that Dr. Oziel is married. This is his girlfriend, who is also a former client. So Judelon is a very complex witness. On one hand, she was the one that turned the tapes into authorities that in part led to their arrest. On the other hand, she also testified that Dr. Oziel taped these sessions in an attempt to try to control Lyle and Erik. Don't forget, now that Jose's gone, those two were the ones that had the keys to the kingdom, which now has a lot of people, in particular the jury, questioning his credibility. After the Dr. Oziel testimony, prosecution entered into evidence this letter, written from Lyle to Erik while they were being held in jail waiting trial. This was a 17-page letter, and in it, Lyle told Erik to destroy it after he was done reading it. For your eyes only. Obviously, Erik didn't destroy it, and it was found in Erik's cell one time during a search, which in and of itself was very controversial, but that's a whole nother video. But in it, Lyle expressed deep regret for the gravity of their crimes. Another piece of damning evidence for the prosecution. So for the prosecution, this was basically a confession. But this was a 17-page and extremely emotional letter from Lyle. There were a lot of things written in there that the defense could use too. Don't forget, Lyle and Erik had a love-hate relationship with their dad. They had a lot of respect for him as a businessman and his legacy, but they hated the abuse, manipulation, and control. And even though the general public kind of knew that he was an asshole, Lyle and Erik were afraid if they told how abusive he was, and also the nature of his abuse, not only would it destroy his legacy, but the legacy of the entire family. So now this guy takes the stand. Psychiatrist Dr. Vicari. He interviews Lyle and Erik and diagnoses Erik with PTSD from the extreme abuse that he dealt with from Jose. Dr. Vicari talked about how difficult it was to get Lyle and Erik to open up. Whenever they would get pressed, they would shut down. And they would also talk about how wonderful their dad was, even though he could tell that it wasn't true. We're kind of past the point on whether or not Lyle and Erik did it. We're now at a point of trying to figure out a motive. Don't forget, prosecution is trying to prove that money is the motive because of the spending spree. But because of Erik's demeanor with Dr. Vicari knew that there was more to the story. Money could not be the motive because they already had the money. The inheritance belonged to Lyle and Erik. They were already living a life of luxury, and if they really wanted the keys to the kingdom, all they had to do was wait. So in Vicari's opinion, between that and Erik's demeanor, there had to be more to the story. It was starting to look like the brothers would rather go to prison than to air their family's dirty laundry. So the defense starts to bring in character witnesses. A lot of people were part of the Menendez family, and none of them had anything good to say about Jose. All of them talked about how abusive he was. They had a cousin that shared a story about Lyle when he was a toddler, where Jose put him on a kitchen counter and told him to jump and he would catch him. And Jose backed away and let Lyle hit the ground. There was another family member that talked about how Jose was hitting both of them with closed fists, and they were around the age of 5. Jose was such a bad person that the prosecution wasn't able to find not one single character witness that was able to say something positive about him. People went on to talk about how Lyle was the golden child, and Erik was treated like a second-class citizen, like his mom. As the trial went on, this picture of this perfect family started to disintegrate, and Erik started to open up. And it's now time for Lyle and Erik to take the stand. Lyle testified that not only did his dad touch him inappropriately when he was young, but he was also forced to perform oral on his own dad. And anytime he wasn't compliant, his dad forced himself on him. Lyle testified that one time Jose forced himself onto Lyle, and Jose always threatened to take Lyle out if he ever said anything. But one particular time it was extremely bad. So Lyle went and told his mom. And his mom said back to him, "Stop. Your father loves you, and sometimes he has to punish you when you do things wrong." When the jury heard this, they had tears in their eyes. Prosecution was like, oh shit. They were starting to realize that this trial was starting to shift. But the problem is that abuse is not a defense for murder. But now it's Erik's turn to take the stand, and this is where things get really, really interesting. Because just like Lyle, Jose essayed Erik. But with Lyle, he eventually stopped around the age of 6. But with Erik, the abuse continued for 12 years. And not only did it continue, but at times it got more violent and sadistic. As Erik got older, there was times where he would tell Jose no. But whenever he told him no, that's when he would experience Jose's wrath. And Erik testified that one time he told Jose no, and he left, and he came back with a knife. Jose put the knife to his throat, and he said, "I should you." And he said, "Next time I will you." Then as a punishment would SA him with tools. And then Jose would force himself on Erik repeatedly. And afterwards, Jose would say to him, "Do you know what will happen if you tell anyone?" And Erik would say back, "You'll hurt me." Jose said back, "No, wrong." And anytime Jose said that to Erik, Erik would hit himself. And Jose repeated himself, "What will happen?" And Erik said, "You'll me." And Jose said, right. The family also testified that they suspected that Jose was doing this to them. And one incident in particular, one of the cousins went and told Kitty. At a very young age, Lyle was mimicking some of the behavior towards his cousin. The cousin told Kitty, she refused to believe it, grabbed Lyle, and took him away. So now fast forward to this time period. The behavior from Jose is continuing with Erik. Erik starts planning to go to college at Stanford to get away from Jose. Jose tells Erik, I don't think so. You're going to UCLA, and the essaying is going to continue. Erik testified that this is when he went to Lyle. Lyle said that he came to him shaking. And Erik said to Lyle, you know those things that Dad does? He's still doing them. Lyle said back to Erik, what things? Erik looked at him in the face and said, you know what things. So Lyle went to confront Jose. Jose was in his study smoking a cigarette. And Lyle said to him, I know everything you're doing and you're a fucking sick person. You're not going to touch my brother again, and if you do, I'm going to the police and I'm going to the family. And Jose said back to him, you listen to me. What I do with my son is my business, and you and I are going to forget that this conversation ever happened. So Lyle went to his mom, and Kitty said to him, what, you think I'm stupid? You better keep your mouth shut. So at this point, the prosecution's like, yeah, okay. You're 19 and 22 years old. If y'all really had a problem, just leave. And Lyle and Erik were like, do you know who our daddy was? Do you know what this man will do to you if you tell him no to anything? Do you know the people and the connections that he has? So Lyle and Erik testified that after they confronted Kitty and Jose, that they could be to protect the family's image. So then this is when they went to go get the you-know-whats. So the night of the shooting, Jose tells Erik to go upstairs and wait for him. Kitty and Jose go into the den. Lyle runs upstairs to Erik. Lyle says to Erik, it's about to happen. They're about to... So they load it up, walk downstairs, bust into the den, and start squeezing the trigger. Jose died instantly. Kitty was still alive, but Lyle reloaded and ended her. Then this is when they went to the movies for an alibi. Then they returned home and called 911. So this is Erik and Lyle's case for self-defense. And the jury sympathized with Lyle and Erik. But Erik and Lyle had a problem. This did not meet the legal definition of self-defense. This is what would be called imperfect self-defense. Self-defense is about being assaulted in the moment. Imperfect self-defense is when someone really actually thinks that they're in danger, but any reasonable person from the outside looking in would say to themselves, they're not in danger in this present moment. So because of this, they were facing first-degree murder, which they then would be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Second-degree murder, which would be a lesser charge, or manslaughter, which would be about a 5 to 10 year sentence. So this is not a trial about innocent or guilty, but to the degree of which they should be punished. And after closing arguments from both sides, the jury goes back to deliberate. Not only was the nation divided, the jury was divided too. Half of the jury, which was mostly men, wanted them to get first-degree murder. Flat out, because they didn't believe in male victims. The other half of the jury, mostly women, wanted them to get manslaughter. So the jury comes back, they go to Judge Weisenberg, and they say, we can't make a decision. And Weisenberg said, then get your ass back there and do it again. The jury goes back and they deliberate for a month. They come back to Judge Weisenberg and they say, we still can't make a decision. If anything, we're even more at odds than what we were before. So they declare a mistrial. So prosecution was like, nah, ball up top, we're running this shit back. And this time, we're going for the death penalty. Before the second trial, it's important to note that there was another high-profile trial that went on. You must acquit. The reason why that's important is because of this man right here, Judge Weisenberg. All within a few years of each other, in the same court system, we had the Rodney King trial, we had the first Menendez trial, we had the OJ trial, and now Menendez Part 2. Weisenberg oversaw Rodney King, Menendez Part 1, and between those two cases and OJ in between, number one, he was embarrassed by his cases, but also he wasn't fucking around with Menendez Part 2. Menendez Part 2 was very different from Part 1. It was a brand new jury, but they were still told to disregard anything that they knew from Part 1. He limited any experts that would support abuse allegations. So no Dr. Vicari or anyone like him. This time around, he didn't allow for the family to testify. He also said that Lyle and Erik are not women, so battered women syndrome is not going to be a defense. And therefore, any trauma is irrelevant and not allowed in the second trial. Erik's lawyer, Leslie, had a fit, and she didn't keep her mouth closed about it. She said it's one thing for you to be biased, but it's another thing for you to allow for your bias to affect your judicial decision in the courtroom. Weisenberg said, hold up, I'm not finished. I want no cameras in this courtroom either. No court TV. Lyle, he can't testify. No testimonies from teachers, coaches, family. The only person who can testify is Erik. The defense is going crazy at this point. Your Honor, how are we supposed to even defend our clients? And Weisenberg said, I'm not finished. It's either first-degree murder or nothing. And when he said that, the second trial was over before it even started. Because remember, this trial is not about innocent or guilty. It's to the degree of guilt. So the prosecution only had to prove that it happened, not any motives, just that it happened. And the jury, in less than a week, unanimously decided guilty. The Menendez brothers are now doing life without the possibility of parole. So now fast forward to present day, 2020. People on TikTok and social media start to pick up on the Menendez case. Society is a lot different about male victims now. It's no longer battered women syndrome, it's now battered person syndrome. But most of all, people are replaying the trial and seeing the mistreatment that these two got. A lot of people feel, including the jury that did the second case, that had they been presented all of the evidence and given the option of manslaughter, that the Menendez brothers would have, yes, done time in prison, but not life without the possibility of parole, and therefore should be out of prison now in 2025. In 2023, Erik and Lyle filed a petition to vacate their murders in the light of new evidence. In October 2024, the district attorney's office said that they would be reviewing this case to see if it needed resentencing. However, the new district attorney in March 2025, this past Monday, depending on when you're watching this, has said that the brothers do not meet the standard for resentencing and also do not meet the standard for standard rehabilitation. And not only that, he says that they pose an unreasonable risk of danger to the community. He said he wants them to apologize, not only for the murders, but for their countless lies. It's now in the hands of a judge who says that he's not even sure if there's anything he can do about it. And if it gets past him, it goes to Governor Newsom in June. And of course, if and when there are any updates, I'll be sure to let you know. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos. And if you're someone who's struggling with trauma or emotional wounds, I have some free resources linked down in the description down below. I also have an exclusive offer of 15% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp so you can get the support that you need. If you want to see more storytelling videos like this, you can click the link on the screen, or there's also links down in the description. And with that being said, I'll see you in the next video.